Class is in session. Welcome to the Wukusu Class podcast, where best-selling author, educator, community organizer, and empowerment coach Agyei drops 15 to 45 minutes of unapologetic leadership, self-empowerment, and Black political education content every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This is where activists sharpen their skills, community leaders get their game tight, and everyday folks learn to wake up, clean up, and stand up, in the words of Malcolm X. Tap in, take notes, and let's build.
I want to start with a good definition of anti-intellectualism. It is the rejection, the devaluing, the serious suspicion or cynicism regarding serious study, analysis, and critical thought. I am not saying that we don't get out in the world and interact with our people in real-time scenarios, that we don't try to apply what it is we learn, or at least teach what it is we learn to others. That is not what we're talking about. I want to talk about some of the characteristics of an anti-intellectual sort of society. There's an over-reliance on charismatic leadership. Instead of people scrutinizing its leaders, we tend to agree with them because they got the right clothes on. We think they're attractive. We think they're the right height, all types of frivolous, foolish stuff. That has nothing to do with leadership. Another highlight, a characteristic of a society that's anti-intellectual, is this deep suspicion of serious theory or books or study, an opposition to people who are nuanced in their thinking or who engage in critical debate, mislabeling those who are thoughtful and intellectually rigorous as being weak. These are some of the things you'll hear. Stuff like, oh, that's fake news. People doing serious research and serious journalism with serious, credible sources. They try to dismiss it. So that's fake news. That's a form of anti-intellectualism. They don't want the general public to think. Everybody quotes Dr. John Henrik Clarke. We quote Dr. Joseph Ben-Jacques, known as Dr. Ben, Dr. Amos Wilson, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Chancellor Williams, and so many other intellectuals and scholars. And the point is to know that these people were not primarily activists and community organizers. They were scholars and intellectuals. And that's fine, because the Black liberation movement, like any movement, has several lanes. And it's up to you to get in where you fit in, to give your gifts and your skills and your personality type, and you figure out where you can make your best contribution. But there's several ways to do that. Activism, or so-called boots on the ground organizing and activism, it is one important lane, but it is not the only lane. Now, let's be real clear about the difference between scholars and intellectuals and activists. Scholars primarily analyze, research, critique ideas. As such, you'll find that scholars or intellectuals are writing books, they're writing in journals, writing scholarly articles. They might create new ways of thinking about something, or new philosophies, new liberation theories. Sometimes you'll find them leading study groups, creating scholarly organizations where they have conferences and they present papers and then the new and latest research in their given field. This is what scholars and intellectuals do. Now, activists are a different breed. Activists, you'll find, tend to be very action-focused. And they're focused on direct action. They want to directly engage sites of power. So you'll find activists are big on mobilizing the people, organizing the people, protesting illegitimate government agencies, or protesting police brutality. Or you'll find that activists are involved with community outreach. They're very much involved in the community. They're knocking on doors. They're making phone calls. They're collecting emails from the village members so they can stay in touch. They're passing out newsletters and newspapers and leaflets and flyers for events. They're putting up flyers all over the neighborhood. They're sending out flyers and doing a podcast about some type of activity or initiative going on in the community. Just so that we're nuanced, do understand that there's sometimes some overlap between the scholars and activists. Sometimes you have scholars and they spend plenty of time in libraries and archives, but family. They also are members of community organizations involved in protests, creating organizations that are a little bit more politically engaged than most intellectuals would. And so I do want to say there is another group of people who tend to blend the attributes of the scholar or the intellectual with some of the attributes of the activist. I am one of them. Many of the people I learned from were also what we call scholar activists. These are people that know how to do the research, write the books. Their writing is tight. You ain't going to find a bunch of grammatical errors. They have good sources. They're giving you citations and references, but they're also on the ground too, doing that type of work, getting involved with protests and community initiatives and challenging sites of power, things of that nature. Just to give an example, that this idea of being intellectual, of being research oriented, of gathering relevant information, there's a history that's been important to us. It runs all throughout our socio-political movements. So the Black Panther Party had a reading list, required books that members were required to read. They also had films that members were required to view. So, for instance, the Battle of Algiers, which talks about the revolution, which shows the revolution, shows the different tactics used and the different people and parties involved. That was required reading for the Black Panther Party. If you take a group like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, it was known as SNCC, or the Revolutionary Action Movement, known as RAM, they had study groups. And we still see study groups around. So having study groups is still a very popular sort of intellectual activity that lends itself to activism. Because what? The activists should be in those study groups, learning more about nationalism, Pan-Africanism, socialism, the African independence movement, the alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. They should be up on their current events, because what? The activists have to engage these issues. They have to explain these issues, and they have to be articulate around these issues. So yes, activists should be all up in study groups, right? Also, during the civil rights movement, they didn't call them quite liberation schools then. They called them freedom schools. They even had freedom libraries and things of that nature. Barbara Herman Ferguson, who is now an ancestor, created through the Organization of Afro-American Unity, Brother Malcolm's group, Liberation School, right? So these are all examples to show you that throughout our history, at least I'm talking about modern history, our people valued the idea that we don't just run out and do something impulsively, that we study, we do research, we analyze, we discuss, right? It's very important. Our people did not just go out here and march, family. They didn't just go out here with guns. They studied, they read, they analyzed systems. The Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale didn't just run out into the streets with guns. It's famously known that Brother Huey P. Newton, rest in power, studied law. He studied law books very closely. And he was able, based on his understanding of the law, to understand what the Panthers were legally able to do in terms of patrolling the police, having guns, right? He was able to understand that there actually was no law against them carrying guns openly. That law would come later because of the Black Panther Party. White folks created the law, you couldn't carry these guns in public. But when they started, that law wasn't in existence. So what he did was studied so that he could understand the weaknesses in the law that they would be able to exploit. And this is an example of why we should always study. To my podcast family, if you're finding value in this podcast, if it's inspiring, educating, and empowering you, consider supporting the work. Your contributions help keep this platform going strong, bringing you knowledge and motivation for the journey ahead. You can send your support via Cash App to $TRU SELF, followed by the numbers 143. Every dollar helps us continue spreading the message of empowerment, leadership, and liberation. Thank you. Examples of anti-intellectualism in our community today, right? You might have heard somebody talking about the books they're reading or their favorite African-centered scholar, or that they're part of a political education circle or study group. And you may have heard another community member say, oh man, that ain't real. That's that wannabe activist, them nerd activists. That's not real activism. Or you might have heard people in our community dismissing philosophy. I don't want to hear about no Kawaii theory. I don't care. I don't want to know about the black nationalism and the ideology of it and Guzu Saba and all that stuff. No, I don't care about that. Right? Intellectual work that ain't nothing but a bunch of nerds trying to find something to do. That's not radical. Right? You'll hear that. You might hear people who look down on people who aren't doing what they refer to as boots on the ground work. And this one is particularly curious to me, because when they do that, they're ignoring all of those people in our movement and in our history. The thinkers, the writers, the filmmakers, the teachers, all these people who were frontline soldiers in our movement that weren't doing, quote unquote, boots on the ground work, but were doing a form of intellectual activism, right? That was just as important. And before I move on, let me just say this thing about boots on the ground. On our YouTube channel, Harlem Liberation School, I do a whole piece on this idea of boots on the ground activism. Let me say this, family. The next time somebody comes to you and say, oh, y'all, you part of that B1 initiative? Oh, man, they just reading and studying this. They got groups on Pan-Africanism. They're not boots on the ground. You tell them this. Do you know where the expression boots on the ground comes from, brother or sister? It's a military term. It refers to the idea that during war time, we need combat troops on the ground ready to fight with arms. But also tell them, did you know that 80% of the entire U.S. military is involved in non-combat related jobs? Most of the military in this country never touch a gun. They never encounter an enemy in that way. So when people tell you boots on the ground, they're taking a term the white man used and they're misapplying it. So let me explain what that means. Did you know that there are cooks, fitness instructors, classroom teachers, filmmakers, architects, artists, photographers, videographers? I can keep going, family. All of these are jobs that the military requires, but they don't see combat. They're not boots on the ground, but yet the military wouldn't be able to do its job effectively without all these positions. So I say that to say, when people do that, what they're participating in, whether they know it or not, when they try to make it seem like because they do boots on the ground work, they knocking on doors, they in the community feeding people, you're not. So what they're doing is important and what you're doing is not. You have to be able to help them understand, no, brother or sister, all of the roles, all of these lanes we run in are important. All of them are necessary. And when they're doing that, they're participating in a very common form of anti-intellectualism. Movements that don't have clear ideology, who we are, what we do, how we do it, what liberation theory do we follow, what is our methodology for doing what we do. They don't have a theory of creating social change, are going to be movements that are ineffective. Glorifying conspiracy theories over verifiable, credible research and long-term strategy is also a sure way to have a losing and ineffective socio-political movement. We're living at the height of the digital age. Most of the American public, and maybe even most of the world, gets most of their news and information from social media. In one way, it's good. It means that you don't have to have this degree or have this corporation's permission or pay this licensing fee. If you have ideas you want to get out and products you want to sell, and you got internet connection and a mic and a camera, hey, you can go ahead and get it in on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. The downside of that, of course, is that there is no one scrutinizing to see if what you're saying is right and exact. It opens it up to people who traditionally would have been marginalized and left out. They wouldn't have had a voice. So it opened the world up to us. But it also opened the world up to crackpots, people who are incompetent, and people who are paranoid or got some issues and are misusing these digital platforms. It's very important that we who take liberation seriously, that we get into a mode of understanding that being studious and really trying to work out some of these ideological issues is important. I want to quickly talk also about what happens when we're anti-intellectuals. What are some of the dangers? All right, so for one, we have great confusion, to put it simply. I want you to think about going to a doctor. You have a series of headaches, of really intense headaches that just started. You go and complain. He says or she says, what's the problem? You say, oh, I got these intense headaches. I don't know where it came from. I haven't eaten anything different. I haven't done anything different. And they don't test you. They don't take your blood. They don't ask for a sample of your urine. They don't check your blood pressure. They don't put the stethoscope on your chest. They simply listen to what you said and they say, oh man, sounds like we have to amputate your right leg. Now you're going to be very shocked and you're going to probably run right out of that doctor's office. Am I right? Here is a doctor who is not properly trained in medicine. If you don't do any real tests, research, investigation, study, analysis, how do you come up with a diagnosis? Well, the same thing happens when we are anti-intellectual. Because we don't do the proper study, because we don't know the historical trend, we jump up with these terrible solutions or so-called remedies to problems. Naturally, because we misdiagnose the problem. We don't even understand why this is a problem and how it was caused and who caused it. So naturally, if your diagnosis is faulty, guess what else will be faulty? Your prescription. If you don't know the ailment someone has, how are you going to prescribe the correct medication for them? This is what happens every day. You go to social media and somebody's talking about a subject and they haven't studied it. If they don't have the basic foundational knowledge of something, they're going to give you a false diagnosis. So the first thing is it creates a confusion and it leads to us coming up with foolhardy or half-baked solutions to real problems. It also makes us more gullible, less likely to scrutinize. Without that sort of intellectual grounding, people will be more likely to fall for propaganda and more likely to involve themselves in cult-like behavior. All type of cult organizations put a lot of time and energy into getting people to be anti-intellectual so that people won't think for themselves, so that people will be more prone to whatever this cult leader has in mind. Also, you tend to have very surface level organizing, surface level discussions, no substance, no analysis of oppression, no understanding of how we internalize our own oppression, and no real discussions of how we get free. That's what happens when you're anti-intellectual. Also, you have weak leadership. When we're anti-intellectual, it gives way to people who are charismatic but have bring no real skill set, no real knowledge base. Slogans replace solutions. So people giving these real catchy themes and slogans, but they have no political program. They have no end game. If you ask them, well, what is it you're after? They couldn't even tell you. This is what happens. One of the dangers when you're anti-intellectual. And then how do people grow? How does an organization and its members and how do people in our community grow and evolve, become better if nobody's doing self-reflection? Nobody's evaluating our progress or lack thereof. They're just repeating the same old slogans and outdated methods from those before them without being critical of them. No evolution, no growth. And then lastly, one of the downsides of being anti-intellectual, it sends a very clear and disturbing message to those people who are writing and doing films and teaching people that they are unimportant, that their work is not valued, that there's no room for what they do in our Black liberation movement. And that is one of the worst messages to send, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the modern era, the 20th and 21st centuries for sure, and I would even make an argument for the 19th century with the convention movement and the abolitionist movement, these people were not people who were random, running out on emotion and impulsive people. These are people who were studied. Did you ever read a speech by Frederick Douglass? Did you ever read any of his autobiographies? Does he strike you as a man that did not respect and value meaning, study, elocution? So even if you go to the 19th century in our organizations, you'll see these are people. We had the convention movement. This was just a movement of conferences, Black people holding these meetings and conferences to talk about how do we become a free and empowered people. So when we keep beating up on study and research, you send a message that these people are not important. And those are people you need. Never let somebody tell you that ideas are not important. The last I checked, family, Buddhism is an idea. Islam is an idea. Christianity is an idea. Capitalism idea. Hell, money is an idea. School is an idea. Safety is an idea. Relationship is an idea. Happiness is an idea. And I can keep going. The whole world is based on ideas, and to some degree those in power are distinguished by being those who are able to sell and promote and enforce and defend their ideas better than others. So when we're teaching something like that, we're teaching a false teaching that ideas are not important. Everything we do is based on some idea. This idea that we should get up early and work hard, that's an idea called work ethic. The idea that, we should let people punk us and we should be willing to pick up arms to defend ourselves, that's called the idea of self-defense. The idea that we should get teddy bears and chocolates and Valentines for our loved ones is an idea called Valentine's. Everything we do is based on ideas. It's very important that we understand that, and we try to avoid any attempts to be anti-intellectual. We need our scholars, intellectuals, filmmakers, writers, educators. We need them. All of our most important movements are amplified, are intensified when we involve that intellectual component. But the history shows us the people that led revolutionary movements, whether they were successful or not, were all intelligent and informed people. Let's go through the list. Kwame Ture, Chokwe Lumumba. We got people that's lawyers in there. Fidel Castro was a lawyer. Che Guevara was a doctor, a physician, right? We can keep going. Assata Shakur, her very famous autobiography, Assata. She was going to school. She went to the Borough Manhattan Community College. In fact, they named their mascot after her, the Panthers, the BMCC Panthers. The truth is, a lot of those people are very informed people. Now, notice I didn't say they were college educated, because going to college and being intellectual are not synonymous. There are people that go to college who are not very intellectual. There's people who didn't finish middle school who are highly intellectual. So Malcolm X, for instance, who drops out in 8th grade, and he's the one that said, education is our passport to the future. In fact, he's also on record as saying one of his greatest regrets is that he didn't get more education. Now, he didn't mean this whitewashed education, obviously, right? So it's very important that we don't allow people to make these emotional appeals to our hood, or if we went to school or not, or no. The history shows that when people lead these movements, they want to know who the enemy is, what weapons they got, how we participate in our own victimization, how we can fight against the propaganda that gets in our way, and what weapons we have at our disposal and what methods we need to fight. All of that falls under the umbrella of research, of discourse or discussion, of study. Or this idea, all we need is unity. If we just come together, listen, man. How many times have you been at an event where black people were there? We were together. We may not have necessarily produced anything political or anything liberatory. We may have been at the cookout, the movie theater, people smoking, whatever they was doing. Liberation requires a lot more than being in the same place or unity. What do we do with these bodies and these brains and these talents and gifts? What direction do we go in? Who are we charging at? Should we physically fight or intellectually fight? All of these are things we have to ask. Or we don't need books, just our lived experience. Stop. You know why? People can never have read a book. They may have lived and they reflect on their life. They take time and they think about it. I remember when this happened to me. I remember when I met this person and their impact. I remember in school and this impact. If you reflect and you make sense out of what you've gone through, yes, your lived experience is valuable, but some people just live. They don't necessarily go and say, damn, when did I start drinking so heavily? What led to that? What was I going through? What triggered me to stop? Or this thing I wanted to do and I was so scared to do it. Why was I scared? See, you still have to reflect. So I want to be clear so no one goes from here thinking that I'm beating up on people who went to school or didn't go to school. I'm saying being intellectual really doesn't have to do with going to a particular building or a school. It's more that you're somebody who enjoys and understands the importance of thinking. We should never be anti-intellectual. I want to also complicate and nuance this by saying at the same time, we don't want to be overly intellectual. Some things, family, we should be able to get to the crux of the issue and be decisive and make a determination, because if you over intellectualize, it means you keep talking and talking and talking past the point where we should have made a decision by now. Then it becomes the paralysis of analysis, as Dr. King said. That indicates a certain fear. People want to skirt around the issue. They know what needs to be done, but nobody wants to say it because maybe they're uncomfortable with the implications of it. So I also want to say I promote intellectualism. I'm against anti-intellectualism, but I'm certainly not saying we over-intellectualize. Some things you go with what you know, you study as much as you can, and then you have to be decisive and move. And knowing that some of the things you need to know, some things you're going to learn through doing it. So we don't want to use research and knowledge as a crutch to cover our cowardice and weakness. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. Instead of this being anti-intellectual, what am I arguing that we need? Well, I'm saying we need to normalize political education. We need to normalize study groups. When I was coming up, and especially when my parents were coming up, that was a very common thing. People took a topic or an issue and they took a whole 6 months, a year, and they studied it. And they had certain books and authors that they focused on so they could wrap their heads around this and be informed. And then what they would do is connect that to some action around it. But the truth of the matter is we can do more. And we need to have liberation schools everywhere black people exist so that wherever you are in your locale, you're getting credible and activist-oriented black political education. We also should celebrate our scholars and our intellectuals, whether they protest the police, feeding people, doing all that, or all they do is write books and teach at a college, because they're playing a very important part. They're making sure that we don't enter a battle ignorant. I want to reaffirm that black power without black thought, black research, black discussion, black analysis is noise, family. Remember, family, every one of our movements, they had an educational component. They had a study component, a research component. I just hope that in 2025, we stop shaming black intellectuals who create our liberation theory. One of the funniest things to me is how, I think I mentioned earlier, how we quote all of these scholars. John Henrik Clarke said, Franz Fanon said, Amos Wilson said. Yeah, you're quoting scholars, so you can't love them on one hand to the point that you're quoting them every other day, and then hate on them on the other hand because they weren't in the streets enough for you. We really have to stop that false dichotomy.